Hi, so today we are going to be going through a process for lesson planning, and I'm going to be doing this mostly through a Think Aloud, in which I pretend to be an 8th grade language arts teacher. So when I was thinking about the year as a whole in 8th grade language arts, I knew the first thing that I wanted to take a look at was the document that breaks down the most important standards. So I went to the DPI website and I found this document, which goes through all of the 8th grade language arts standards, and then over here where it says number of operational items by standard, says how many items on the EOG are there going to be tied to each of those standards. So by reading this, I can really tell, okay, which are my standards that have some of the higher question range, to where I know that I need to be allotting a lot of time to those standards and really hitting them multiple times throughout the year, which standards are slightly less important because they are not touched as often on the EOG. So that's where I wanted to start. And I had to combine this with actually reading the standards themselves. As you can see here, this document only shows the sort of code for the standard, not the actual standard. So from here, I then wanted to create a document that would align the objectives with the skills and some potential strategies. So I looked at this 8th grade specifications document. This is available on the Berry Hill Google Drive, and it includes grades 4 through 8 by comparing the different shifts that we're seeing. And for example, in 8th grade, there's a shift from finding multiple pieces of textual evidence to judging the best supporting evidence. So this is going to help us to really make sure that we're hitting the correct rigor level at each grade level. So this document goes through each objective, then lists what are the terms and skills, what are some potential strategies. So the objective that I'm going to be looking at today is about characterization, and it's RL 8.3, analyze how particular lines of dialogue or incidents in a story or drama propel the action, reveal aspects of a character, or provoke a decision. So we're really going to be focusing on this part right here, reveal actions of a character. That is part of my unit on characterization, which is part of a greater focus on the story elements that we're covering during first quarter. So once I looked at these specifications, then I wanted to make a long-term plan for my entire 8th grade year. So here's what that ended up looking like. I wanted to break down my quarters and then align those quarters with the units in my textbook, Holt McDougall, talk about the key concepts in those units, what read aloud would best lend itself to those units, and then what writing project could we do as a culmination at the very end. So we're still in quarter one, and I am in the second unit, which is focusing on characterization. So once I took this kind of long view of each of the quarters, I wanted to make a list of the key academic vocabulary that I knew my students would need to know. So where did I get this list? I got it by looking at the language and the standards, but also by looking at my assessments. So looking at the release EOG, and then looking at my unit assessment, which I chose to get from Holt McDougall. But we could also be looking at SchoolNet, we could be looking at Mastery Connect. We just know that we need to look at the assessment first. So that's what I wanted to do before actually writing my daily objectives, just to make sure I was building properly towards that end of unit assessment. So once I made my list of key terms and I analyzed my assessment, I broke down my unit into subtopics. And then next to each subtopic, I wrote down the objectives for each day. What I tried to do was make sure that there were at least a few exit tickets a week. Not necessarily one every day, but I knew that I needed to include those fairly frequently so I could always be gathering data about where my students are. So for today's lesson, we're going to be taking a look at this objective. Students will infer character traits, cite textual evidence, and explain why that evidence is direct or indirect. This is assuming that the previous day, students will contrast traits with feelings and define and analyze methods of direct characterization and indirect characterization. So some of what we're doing today will be a review, a refresher of that traits and feelings work that the students did yesterday. So once I determined my objective, my next step was making really like a solid resource to teach that to my kids. So to do that, I wanted to start with a little bit of teacher input or direct instruction. And so I chose to do closed style notes because I know that closed style notes are going to cut down on my lag time, where I'm only having students write down a few key phrases, and I'm going to build in time for them to turn and talk and really process those notes. So I started off by writing down a few indirect methods of characterization, a few direct methods, and then some actual examples of each. Then I wanted to pull some great excerpts to allow us to practice applying these types of characterization and citing textual evidence, and then explaining whether is it direct or indirect. So where did I get these excerpts? In the Common Core standards, there's an appendix that talks about text exemplars for each grade level. So I like to go here, and then besides this, I also like to go back to my Holt McDougall because that online textbook is going to provide me with some other additional excerpts to use. So for this lesson, I chose to use one excerpt from Little Women. And this is going to be my direct instruction where I really do my teacher modeling. I'm going to read this text to the kids. They're going to follow along with me. And then as I answer these questions, the students will be doing the same exact thing on their papers, citing the evidence along with me, and then explaining why is it direct or indirect characterization. After that, students are going to work in partners to do the exact same thing, the same processes, but with a different text. So they're going to be doing that with The Dark is Rising, and just this very small excerpt of that text. And I built in an affirmative check. So after students answer question 6 and question 7, their job is going to be to get onto their Chromebooks and get onto Quizlet and study their unit terms. This will be a signal to me that they are ready for a check. So rather than just raising their hands, which could potentially cause them to waste time, they're going to be studying their terms, and then I know I can come and check 6 and 7 against my exemplar before students are ready to move on to independent practice. Independent practice looks very similar, it's just a different text. So once again, the students are picking out character evidence and saying, is it direct or indirect characterization, using a different text, this time from Dragon Wings. At the end of the lesson, if students finish 8 and 9, they can go on to this written extension. This is just another way to try to offer differentiated rigor levels. So that kid who does finish early and has mastered it, as I go around with my pen in hand during the independent practice, again, checking students' work against my exemplar, students who finish and show mastery can go on to this written extension to allow them to write a whole paragraph in response to one of the characters that they've seen. Then at the very end of the lesson, students are going to be completing an exit ticket. This was an excerpt that I got from my Holt McDougall textbook. And then the questions are, again, very similar. They're citing that textual evidence to characterize the two different characters. And they're saying, is it direct or indirect? As I was making this, I was also thinking about my lesson plan components. And so here's the lesson plan components. The objective, I have my student-friendly version and I have my standards version. The do now, I know that I want to have something that my kids can do right away when they walk in that does not require my instruction. So they're going to be examining a picture from a movie and doing a quick write that is a review of yesterday's objective, which is distinguishing between a character's traits and feelings. The I do is going to be the close style notes we talked about earlier, but I am going to pause and have students do a turn and talk to share their own example of each characterization type. That's going to serve as a check for understanding. The rest of the I do is going to be a teacher read aloud of Little Women, where we stop to answer characterization TDQs. The We Do students are going to work with partners to read an excerpt from The Dark is Rising, and again, stopping to answer those TDQs. And then we'll have that affirmative check that I spoke about, where students will partner study on Quizlet as a signal to me that they're ready for me to check 6 and 7 against my exemplar. The You Do students are going to independently read an excerpt from Dragon Wings, again answering the TDQs. And then if they finish that early, they can go on to continue the written response extension. And then again, there will be an exit ticket. I wanted to specify in my lesson plan that mastery would be a 5 out of 6. Where do they get those 6 points? 2 accurate traits and feelings, 2 supporting pieces of evidence, and 2 labels of direct and indirect. So once I had this done, what I wanted to do is create a Smartboard notebook that really will allow me to quickly teach this information and to model written responses for my kids. So this was my Smart notebook. Let's see if I can make this a little more visible. So here's the quick write we talked about earlier. Consider the scene. How would you describe the character? Does the evidence develop a feeling or trait? Now, as I go through the lesson, I would move these notes so that students can follow along with me. But again, they're writing minimal information. I'm not asking them to write all of the words here because that would really slow some students down. So we would read these together. We could stop and discuss them, but we would probably want to keep the discussion a little bit minimal because there's going to be a CFU where students are going to have a chance to turn and talk and share their own examples. So here's a real world example. Again, we would go through this together and we could even cover up some of the answers and then wait until student discussion to show some potential possibilities. That would be one way of doing this. The direct methods. I like to switch up the order of my words because I find if I put them in the right order, sometimes the kids will get ahead in their notes. So again, we would read these together and then we would talk about this example and the students could turn and talk and share their own example. Here is where I would read this. I like to add notes like this, teacher modeling, so that I'm reminding myself in the middle of my lesson the steps that I'm going to take. So here I would pick up the pen tool and I could model exactly for kids. We could pick up the highlighter tool and we could highlight back in the passage the evidence that supports their answer because we know those are good strategies for readers to practice. But this just goes straight through that worksheet. If you're wondering how did I get these excerpts to appear, I used the camera tool and then I went to my handout and all I did was take pictures of the text and the questions. And then that would appear in my Smartboard for me to move around and kind of do whatever I wanted to with. So the Smartboard continues all the way through the independent practice and then even to the exit ticket so that I could leave this up on the board and then really emphasize to students the directions during the exit ticket to try to minimize that confusion. So that was really the extent of the lesson. And I know that it might seem a little bit time consuming, but that to me is part of the beauty of being a middle school teacher is we are only responsible for one prep a day. So by taking the time to build these excellent lesson plans and these excellent resources, hopefully we can reuse those from year to year and just make our instruction that much stronger. Thanks.